You're watching a classic Western movie scene. A rugged cowboy sits beside a glowing campfire as the sun sets over the prairie, peacefully eating a simple meal of beans from a tin plate. Hollywood has sold us this romantic image for decades, but what if I told you that image is almost entirely a myth? The reality of what cowboys actually ate on the great cattle drives of the 19th century was a far more complex, gritty, and often shocking story of survival. These 15 cheap meals weren't about taste. They were about staying alive long enough to get the cattle to market. And some of these delicacies will make your stomach turn. 1. Son of a gun stew. Picture this. A young calf stumbles and falls behind the herd for the third time today. The trail boss makes a hard decision. This animal won't make it to market. But in the world of cattle drives, nothing goes to waste. When a young calf couldn't keep up with the herd, Cookie would transform what others might see as waste into the ultimate delicacy. Heart, liver, tongue, kidneys, brains for thickening, and the prized marrow gut. A milk-filled tube from nursing calves that gave the stew its rich flavor. Cowboys didn't call this desperation food. They called it son of a gun stew, and they considered it better than any restaurant meal. The secret ingredient? Fresh calf brains mixed right into the pot as a natural thickener. One chuck wagon cook could feed 15 hungry cowboys with a single calf, stretching every organ into a hearty meal that kept them going for days. Why eat organs instead of regular meat? Simple economics and survival. The prime cuts of beef belonged to the trail boss. They were his investment walking to market. Organs, however, spoiled quickly and couldn't be sold, making them free protein for the crew. The marrow gut was the most prized ingredient because it was only available from nursing calves and provided essential fats that cowboys' bodies craved after weeks of lean eating. This wasn't just about using everything, it was about getting maximum nutrition from minimal resources. 2. Hardtack and sop. Imagine trying to bite into a piece of wood for breakfast. That's essentially what cowboys faced every morning when Cookie handed out the hardtack. These rock-hard biscuits were so tough that cowboys joked they could stop bullets, and some probably could have. The challenge was simple. How do you make bread that won't spoil in 100-degree heat for months at a time? The answer was hardtack. Flour, water, and salt, baked until it was harder than a horseshoe. Cowboys called it gun-wadding because it was tough enough to stop a bullet. But smart cowboys knew the secret to making it edible. The magic happened when Cookie threw flour into leftover beef grease, creating soap, a thick, savory gravy that transformed rock-hard biscuits into something worth eating. A single batch of hardtack could last months without spoiling, and cowboys carried it in their saddlebags as emergency rations. Why choose hardtack over regular bread? Storage and economics. Fresh bread spoiled within days in the heat and humidity of the trail, but hardtack lasted indefinitely without refrigeration. A 50-pound barrel of hardtack cost about $3 and could feed a cowboy for 2 months. That's roughly 2,400 calories per day for just pennies. Regular bread would have required daily baking using precious fuel and time that Cookie didn't have while keeping up with a moving herd. 3. Beans, prairie fuel. Every morning before dawn, the same ritual kept the entire cattle drive alive. Someone would check the bean pot that had been simmering all night, stirring the contents that would fuel 15 hard-working men through another brutal day on the trail. Without this simple pot of beans, the great cattle drives of the American West would have been impossible. The process started at dawn. Dried pinto beans would soak in water, jiggling around in the chuck wagon all day. By evening, they'd go straight on to the fire, slow cooking all night to be ready for breakfast. Cowboys didn't call beans prairie fuel and whistleberries for nothing. These were the backbone of every trail drive, providing cheap protein that could feed a crew for months. A single pot of beans fed the entire crew and provided the energy needed for 12-hour days in the saddle. One trail drive consumed over 1,000 pounds of beans in 3 months. That's nearly 70 pounds per cowboy. Dried beans cost about 8 cents per pound and provided 1,500 calories per pound, making them one of the cheapest sources of energy available. 4. Jerky, cowboy candy. Here's the great irony of cowboy life, surrounded by thousands of head of prime beef, yet rarely tasting a fresh steak. Those cattle represented the trail boss's entire fortune, his walking bank account that would pay everyone's wages at the end of the drive. Killing a healthy steer for dinner was like a bank teller helping himself to the vault. So, what did cowboys eat for meat? The answer was jerky, and lots of it. When a steer went lame, got sick, or simply couldn't keep up with the herd, that's when the real work began. This wasn't the tender jerky you buy today. Trail jerky was cut thick, salted heavily, and dried until it was hard as leather. Cowboys had to gnaw on it for minutes just to get a bite, but it wouldn't spoil in the desert heat. Cowboys called jerky cowboy candy, though it bore no resemblance to anything sweet. A single steer could produce 200 pounds of jerky, enough to feed a crew of 15 cowboys for 2 weeks. The salt content was so high that cowboys needed gallons of water daily just to process it. Why make jerky instead of eating fresh meat? Preservation and portability were everything on the trail. Fresh beef spoiled within hours in desert heat, but properly made jerky lasted for months. More critically, jerky concentrated the nutrition. 100 pounds of fresh meat became about 20 pounds of jerky, making it 5 times more nutrient-dense. This meant cowboys could carry weeks of protein in their saddlebags without weighing down their horses. 5. Sourdough biscuits. Nothing could ruin a cattle drive faster than a cook who couldn't make decent bread. Cowboys would literally refuse to sign on to a drive if they knew the cook consistently turned out rock-hard doorstops instead of fluffy biscuits. The cook protected his sourdough starter like it was made of gold, feeding it daily with flour and water, and on cold nights, he'd actually sleep with the crock to keep the yeast alive. This wasn't just dedication, it was survival. Without that living culture of wild yeast, there would be no bread on the trail. Good sourdough biscuits were fluffy, tangy, and could soak up gravy like a sponge. Bad ones were doorstops that could break teeth. The sourdough starter was often decades old, passed down from cook to cook like a precious family heirloom. Some starters were so prized that cooks would risk their lives to save them during river crossings or stampedes. Why sourdough instead of regular bread? Sourdough starter eliminated the need for commercial yeast, which was expensive and often unavailable on the frontier. More importantly, the fermentation process made the bread more digestible and nutritious. This was crucial for cowboys who often suffered from poor nutrition. 6-shooter coffee. Every morning at 3 a.m., the ritual that would wake the dead began. The coffee that emerged from the chuck wagon wasn't just strong, it was legendary. Cowboys claimed it could float a horseshoe, and they weren't exaggerating. This wasn't your morning cup of joe. This was liquid survival in a tin cup. The process was simple but brutal. Boil water, throw in a handful of ground coffee per cup, and let it brew until it was thick as mud. Cowboys didn't drink coffee, they drank liquid courage strong enough to keep a man awake for 18 hours straight. The arrival of Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee revolutionized trail drives, giving consistent pre-roasted beans that eliminated the guesswork of roasting green coffee over an open fire. A typical trail drive consumed 300 pounds of coffee in 3 months. That's 20 pounds per cowboy, nearly a cup every 2 hours, day and night. The coffee pot never left the fire, and cowboys would grab a cup whenever they needed fuel for the next watch. 7. calf fries, Rocky Mountain oysters. When it came time for branding and castration, nothing went to waste. The byproducts of this necessary ranch work became calf fries, or Rocky Mountain oysters. Rolled in cornmeal and fried until golden, cowboys didn't just tolerate this food, they celebrated it. The taste? Cowboys described it as somewhere between chicken and veal, with a texture that was surprisingly tender when cooked right. One roundup could provide enough calf fries to feed the entire crew for days, prepared with the same care as a Sunday dinner back home. During branding season, these organs were completely free. They were removed anyway, and would otherwise be thrown away. More importantly, they were incredibly nutritious, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals that cowboys' bodies craved after months of limited diet. 8. Wild game stew. The crack of a rifle meant one thing: fresh meat tonight. When cowboys couldn't stand another day of beans and jerky, they hunted whatever moved on the Great Plains. This wasn't sport. It was survival. When beef wasn't available, cowboys hunted whatever moved. Deer, rabbit, prairie chicken, and even rattlesnake ended up in the stew pot. The rule was simple: if it couldn't kill you, it was dinner. Prairie chicken was prized because it tasted like domestic chicken, but was free for the taking. A good hunter could bag enough birds to feed the crew for days. Rabbit was common but small. It took 6 rabbits to make a decent stew for 15 men. Cowboys claimed it tastes like chicken, though most admitted you had to be pretty hungry to find out. 9. Dried fruit. Cowboy candy. A small sack of dried fruit was worth more than a cowboy's weekly wages. These wrinkled pieces of apple or peach were so precious that cowboys would literally fight over the last one. They were rationed out like medicine, giving each man just a few pieces on special occasions or to treat sick cowboys who couldn't keep down regular food. A single bag of dried fruit cost more than a cowboy's weekly wages, making them a luxury that appeared only on the most well-funded drives. Dried fruits contained concentrated vitamin C that cowboys couldn't get from their regular diet of meat, beans, and bread. Even small amounts could prevent the bleeding gums, loose teeth, and weakness that characterized scurvy. 10. Vinegar pie. When the crew's morale hit rock bottom, after a particularly difficult river crossing, a stampede, or just too many weeks of the same monotonous food, the chuck wagon cook would reach for his secret weapon. It wasn't a gun or a whip, it was a bottle of vinegar and his skill at creating something that seemed impossible: a delicious dessert made from ingredients that had nothing to do with fruit. When fresh fruit was impossible to find, creativity took over. Vinegar pie used vinegar, sugar, and eggs to create a tart, sweet dessert that satisfied the crew's craving for something different. The recipe was simple, but required skill. Too much vinegar, and it was inedible. Too little, and it was just sweet mush. A good vinegar pie tasted surprisingly like lemon pie. Vinegar pie appeared for special occasions: successful river crossings, reaching important landmarks, or when morale was particularly low. 11. Sowbelly and beans. Picture a piece of pork so salty it could preserve itself for months in blazing desert heat without spoiling. Sowbelly was salt pork taken to the extreme, so heavily cured that cowboys joked it could tan leather. But this wasn't just preserved meat. It was the secret ingredient that made everything else edible. A single piece the size of a playing card could transform a pot of bland beans into something with actual flavor. The fat that rendered out was liquid gold, saved and used for cooking everything from eggs to gravy. Cowboys didn't eat sowbelly because they liked it. They ate it because without the fat and salt, they'd literally waste away in the desert heat. The salt content was so extreme that the meat had to be soaked before cooking, or it would be inedible. But that salt wasn't just for preservation, it was medicine. Men sweating through 16-hour days in 100-degree heat lost dangerous amounts of salt, and salt deficiency killed faster than most other trail dangers. 12. Prairie oyster cocktail. When a cowboy stumbled into camp looking green around the gills, whether from too much whiskey in the last town, a stomach bug, or just the general misery of trail life, there was a cure that was guaranteed to either fix the problem or make the patient forget all about it. The prairie oyster cocktail wasn't food. It was frontier medicine that tested a man's resolve as much as it treated his ailments. This prairie oyster cocktail was made of a raw egg dropped into a shot of whiskey, seasoned with salt and pepper, and swallowed whole. Most cowboys could only choke down one prairie oyster in their lifetime, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The reality was probably just shock therapy that made you forget whatever was wrong with you. Cowboys had no access to doctors or real medicine, so they relied on folk remedies that often did more psychological than physical good. 13. Spotted pup, rice pudding. On rare occasions when the chuck wagon had been recently resupplied in a town, something magical might appear that reminded the crew of their mother's kitchens. The sight of rice pudding being prepared, or spotted pup, as cowboys called it, could bring grown men to tears, not from the taste, but from the memories it triggered of home, family, and a time when food was about comfort rather than mere survival. When leftover rice needed to be used up and the crew deserved something special, spotted pup would appear, rice pudding with raisins that looked like spots on a dog. This simple dessert used rice, milk, when available, sugar, and precious raisins to create something that reminded cowboys of their mother's cooking. It was comfort food on the range. The raisins were so valuable that they were counted out carefully, making sure each cowboy got exactly the same number in his portion. Fights had started over less, and fairness was crucial when dealing with something this precious. 14. Lizard and snake soup. There comes a moment on every cattle drive when the unthinkable becomes necessary. When the regular game has disappeared, when supplies are running dangerously low, and when the choice is between eating something unpalatable or watching the crew weaken from hunger, decisions get made that test everyone's resolve. These were the darkest moments of trail life, when survival trumped every other consideration. When game was scarce and supplies were low, desperate cowboys turned to whatever protein they could find. Lizards, large insects, and various reptiles ended up in the soup pot during the worst times. This wasn't regular food, it was survival food for when everything else ran out. Cowboys who ate lizard soup usually didn't talk about it afterward, but it kept them alive when nothing else was available. The taste was described as better than starving, which wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement. But when faced with the alternative of watching the crew weaken and potentially die, these hard choices had to be made. Why resort to eating reptiles and insects? Pure survival necessity. During droughts, regular game disappeared and water sources dried up, leaving cowboys with no choice but to eat whatever protein they could find. Starvation was a real threat that could kill faster than most other dangers on the trail. Large lizards actually provided decent nutrition. They were high in protein and contained essential amino acids that human bodies needed to function. 15. Clean the chuck wagon. Stew. As the cattle drive neared its end and the lights of the destination town appeared on the horizon, one final ritual would mark the completion of their incredible journey. Every remaining scrap of food in the chuck wagon would be inventoried and transformed into one last meal from the odds and ends that had sustained them across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. The ultimate cowboy meal wasn't planned. It was whatever remained in the chuck wagon at the end of a long drive. The last scraps of jerky, dried vegetables, hardtack crumbs, and anything else that was edible would be thrown together. This final meal represented months of survival, creativity, and making do with whatever was available. Cowboys often said this last meal tasted better than any fancy restaurant food because it represented the end of the trail and the promise of real civilization ahead. It wasn't pretty, but it symbolized the cowboy spirit of never giving up and never wasting anything. The reality of cowboy food wasn't romantic. It was brutal, monotonous, and designed purely for survival. These 15 meals kept America's cowboys alive long enough to build the cattle industry that fed a growing nation. While we romanticize the Old West, the truth is that cowboys survived on grit, beans, and whatever they could find on the endless prairie. If you enjoyed discovering the shocking truth about what cowboys really ate, hit that subscribe button for more surprising stories from America's forgotten past.